All right, I'm going to try to walk through field sketching, how we're going to construct a vignette when we're out. And this will actually be an interior. We're going to look at both a 1 point and then a 2 point. This classroom that you're probably familiar with. A few things to note. I've set up this camera to be exactly at my eye height. It's important because we're going to talk about the horizon line. You need to first understand where your eye height is. Your perspective, your view is from exactly where you are located. So right now, you'll see way up there, there's a line drawn there. And that line is exactly my eye. When you're drawing, where exactly your is in relation to what you're not. Something can help you figure that out. Right now, we're going to use that line out there so we can talk about something. So the first thing we're going to want to do is I'm going to try to flip this between the drawing and this view. First thing we're going to do is figure out the steps of constructing a correct perspective. So let's see how it's going to autofocus back and forth a bit. So the first thing I'm going to do is say, look, no matter what, we're going to start with a horizon line. And the best thing to think about is that this is a line that you're going to construct a perspective off of. Do not think of it as a ground plane, more of like you're building, you're measuring from this line. Okay, this is the eye height that we just, this datum that's out on that edge. Next thing we're going to do is after we have the horizon line, we're going to determine a strong vertical line for us to measure off of. Okay, so right now this is going to be a 1 point perspective, which means that back wall is square to us. We're going to have one vanishing point directly down here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this right edge and say that's my strong vertical right now. Okay, so let's look at this and let's start with a kind of rough idea of saying, okay, with this drawing, I know there's going to be roughly, I want this line to fall somewhere here. I don't know its height yet. Let's see, I'll focus. Yeah, okay. I don't know its height yet. I'm just roughing this in. Okay, horizon line, and then this idea of the strong vertical. Notice the strong vertical doesn't end on the horizon line, right? It's coming past it, and I'm just letting it exist there. Now, what we're going to want to do next is figure out what is our unit of measurement. Okay, so right now, when we look back at this, we're going to use our horizon line down to, this is where you see somebody, I'm reaching my arm straight out and I'm putting the cap of it right at the horizon line. Does that make sense? And then I'm putting my thumb right at the bottom of that wall. Does that make sense? I'm getting a unit of measurement. Okay. See that? My thumb is right here on the pencil and the top of that's there. Now I can go like this and say that's 1 unit below and 1 unit above is almost to the ceiling. 1 and maybe focus, maybe about 1 1/4. Okay, so if we look at this, this is where we can start determining scale in our drawing. So whatever unit I pick, this is where we're going to start figuring something out. I can pick any distance down. That's my unit now. Now, if that's my unit, that was my original size. I say, remember what, if I say that was the bottom of the wall down there, I can do that. Remember, it was 1. I'm estimating same distance up plus 1/4. There's a half. There's 1/4. There. There is the height. So right now, I've estimated and started to draw that back wall in, right? This was that strong corner. This was my unit of height. Remember, because we're square to this. And now these two lines are parallel because they're not in perspective. We only have, well, this is a 1 point perspective, so that back wall is square to us. Okay. But now we got to figure out where our vanishing point is. So we've got our unit up here. I know I'm standing and looking directly here. So I can take that same unit and say, okay, where is my unit increment? So I go, I'm doing this all the time. There's my unit. And I say, how far over am I looking from this edge to where I'm centered? And I know I'm standing directly about there. If I look square at this wall, that's where my eyes are hitting, okay? So now I'm measuring, using my unit of measurement, figuring out how far over I am from this edge. It looks like I'm about 3/4 of a unit. Okay, come back down. And remember, I say if this was 1, I could say, well, what is about that? That's about 1 full over. There's my vanishing point. Does that make sense? We figured out my vanishing point was about 3/4 of an increment over. That I estimated as 1 full increment over. That's about 3/4. So this is my vanishing point, right? So we have our horizon line and our vanishing point. Now, just as I measured that, because that plane is square to us, I can actually measure where the other edge is too. I'm going to use my increment again. Okay, there's my increment, and now I'm going to measure from this side 1, 2, 3. Oh, just about dead 4, right? So if I take this increment, and I go 1 over 2, 3, 4. That's about right. There is my back wall. If you notice, remember when I was measuring over, it looked like the door. Remember, I stopped that when I measured 3 over, I hit right on the edge of the door here. So I know that door was right at 3, so I can actually start to rough that in too. Let's look at a few more things. Figure out where that door is on that back wall. So now I remember I took my increment and I measured over 3, 2, 3 is like that on the door. And then the door is maybe 3/5, almost the whole way. And what is the height of the door? So let's look at this here. And look at how the door goes just pretty much the top of that, or that the electric conduit. So I can actually just go, there's my 1 unit right there. And how much is it to go up? It's about half. So it's almost like graphing this out. This whole back wall is square to us. I measured 3 over for the edge of this. Remember, it was 1. I said it was about 3/5 for the width of the door. The other edge of it's here. And then we measured up. I said it was 1 and then a half again. So I could actually measure on the side. It's a half up. That's that kind of conduit that was coming across. And now here's that door. So really what we've done is just drawn an elevation of that back wall. But because we have this vanishing point, we can now say, okay, well, the edge of this vanishing point. This is why that those drawing tutorials on getting used to drawing a straight line, projecting, getting that line to project. Getting better and better. Oh, you're going to rotate this plot. Sometimes I'm always I'm best at drawing a line from right to left like that. So I'm looking at it. All right. And now all of a sudden, we've got this room boxed out, right? So what we've done, horizon line first, always. Then strong vertical. Vertical is second. Okay. Find a base unit was third. We found the vanishing point because this is a 1 point, so we could figure out exactly where we were looking directly at the wall, right? That was one way to do it. And from there, we could project out. Okay. So this was easy because I know where I'm standing and I know where I was looking dead straight at this. It's easy for me to find that one vanishing point. When we do a 2 point, we're actually going to use a different method of finding the vanishing point, right? Once we have that vanishing point, I kind of boxed in to understand this. Now let's find 1 to 2 of the windows on this side. So there's a few things that happen over here. Okay. Like this. So this camera really only picking up 1 of those windows right now, so I'll just leave it to 1. Okay, we can tell that that window, we can tell that this window is taller. If I project this line back, it hits about here on that back wall. So in perspective, we can only measure in what we call the picture plane. What happens, we're using that back wall as the picture plane. So everything is kind of being brought to that surface as an understanding. This will make more sense when we do the 2-point perspective, but that back wall we're understanding as a flat orthographic drawing in way. It's this elevation that we're perspecting off of. So we can take this line and actually visualize where would it hit on this wall, and we can measure and get an understanding on this wall because this is square to us, right? So we can see where like the sill comes in at a certain height. Where does that hit? We can figure out where that is. That the sill comes in just above that conduit. Okay? This comes in just above that conduit. Okay, so we can actually find those measurements and track them. So let's do that really quick. I take my unit. I say, okay, I want to find that sill. I can't measure over here because it's in perspective, right? But this back wall is square to us, so I can measure in that. This is not being perspective of. But I do know that that line, the sill, shoots over, hits this wall, and hits. So it hits about right there between the conduit and that space. So I need to know what is the dimension from there down. Now that's barely maybe a third of my unit. So I'm going to do this really quick and say, okay, I know the sill of the window. There was half, it was a little below half. So this, or follow that over. Hit here. Now all of a sudden, we know this wall is in perspective, so I'm going to bring that perspective out. Now, as soon as what's going to start happening is we're going to start forming a fan on this drawing. And what should always happen is that fan should be perfectly incremental and then become completely horizontal at the horizon line, and then fan back up. So if you're ever looking at a wall and you don't, and your lines do not form a perfect fan that becomes level at the horizon and then comes back out, something's not constructed correctly. Okay. So that was approximately the sill. Now we need to find out where that window is. We got to find the top, right? Remember we said the top was a bit, there was a conduit and a bit above that. So I'm just going to estimate. Conduit was right above this door. Remember, it was a little above the conduit. So I'm going to come over here. I'm going to take it again. Keep this out. So now I have a projection of where the top of the window is and the bottom of the window is in perspective, right? But now I need to figure out how far over these things are. Okay. So we can look at this, and now I can use my measurement as a proportioning system. Okay, so here is, there we go. Okay, there's my unit. Now I want to see how far over is that first. This is here because I'm looking at the screen over. It is barely. Bro, I was like 3 to there. It was 1 more to get to the wall. It is barely a quarter from the door. Yeah, so it's like a quarter. Like it was a quarter of an increment to go from the door to here, and it's about a little less than that to go from here to here. Now from here to here, that unit. Yeah, okay. Barely a third for the window. Okay, this would make sense. So when I measured this out, it was 1 unit to go from here to here. It was a little less than this. Get to the edge. So if I took this space, a little bit less than that, see where the quarter, where the edge of this window is. Okay, and then it was about a third of a unit. So I can say, well, what was my unit? The unit is here to here. So a full unit, pretty big, wasn't a full unit, But that looks a little wide. Let's see if I scoot some different. What was it? There, I did it about a half. Ooh, I think I moved the camera. No, there we go. Okay. There's my unit. How much? Yeah, it's barely a third. Okay, that's what's good. I did that. So if that's a unit, full unit, and then from here, it was only like half a unit. All right, that's a little better. Okay. So we're starting to just get the room boxed out, right? Now, what's interesting is that, well, let's leave it for here right now. The 2 point, we're going to add some more detail and talk about a few more things. Okay. Pause this one. All right, we're going to shift this to be a 2 point perspective to kind of understand how to find those multiple vanishing points. So again, right now, I want you to think of it as a 1 point perspective. This entire back wall, all of these lines are parallel to each other. One way to think about that is if we look at the frame of this view, they're all parallel to the top and bottom of this. But now what we're going to do is we're going to stand in the exact same place. We're just going to physically turn our body to, instead of looking directly at this wall, we're going to turn and look directly here. Okay, but we're not just going to turn our head. We're actually going to turn our whole body to look directly at that corner. Now, what's important about this that is now look at some things that have changed. Got it. What's interesting here is a few more things. You can still see the eye height is exactly the same. Okay, so my horizon line is still going to be the same thing. What's also interesting is now let's look at it. That back wall, we are not looking straight at, so it's no longer in, it's now in perspective. And you can tell it's in perspective because look, all of these lines, if we think of it, this is now, these lines are now fanning, right? They're pointing up, down below the horizon line, and they're pointing down when they're above the horizon line, right? So that back wall has now become in perspective because we turn and we're looking dead over at that corner there, okay? Well, that's kind of interesting. This worked out pretty well. I'm going to go stand next to this window and you're going to see, notice how when we talk about the fan of the perspective, look at how this, my eye height, dead at that moment. So what that does is when we draw this horizon line, that you can tell this is when we're out on site and you might not be able to measure your height or walk over to what it is. What you do is you look for any incremental thing that's changing from pointing down. And if one gets level, then you know that's your eye height, because if it's not angling down or angling up, then it's at the horizon line, right? So that's a way to figure out where you're at. Now, rarely does something line up so perfectly. Usually one's going down and one's going up and you know you're somewhere in the middle of that. This one, my eye height was like just dead on that level. So it appears level, okay? So we're going to walk through the exact same thing. And we're going to try to box out this, and we're going to show you some interesting things about the repetition in a perspective. So first thing we do is we draw a horizon line. No matter, I'm going to do a trick here is actually lock my pinky onto the page. If I know I'm drawing a straight line, helps get a little bit of a level line. That was the first thing, right? Horizon line. Second thing we're going to do is we're going to find a strong vertical that we can measure off of. So when we did this last time, the whole back wall was in the picture plane, right? The whole back wall was all an area that we could measure in. But right now, we've in essence set a flat plane that we're looking at that happens to just hit right at that corner, okay? So we can only measure, we can only take measurements in this vertical line right at this moment. Okay, so we want to say like this line right here is going to be our strong vertical because we can gauge both perspective coming this way and the perspective coming this way off of it. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to make this a strong vertical, and again, you know, I'm going to cheat. I'm going to, well, I can see it. The corner of this room, so the bottom floor edge coming here and the bottom floor edge coming there, I can see it. It's right underneath this table right there. So I can say, where does my horizon line and that edge hit? There's my increment there. Okay. That's my unit. It should be 1.25 up, exactly like it was last time, because that's the same. Okay. So it means I can look at this and say, I'm going to draw this here. Remember, I'm leaving it long. I'm going to say this is a unit down. Remember, look, I'm even changing the size of this because it's a proportioning system, right? So I might draw this drawing a little smaller and say that that's 1 unit. I can take that same amount up again, and then 1/4 of that, that's half, that's 1/4, that's 1/4. Okay, there is my strong vertical. Bottom corner, top corner. Okay. Now we have to figure out the vanishing points. In the previous one, we knew we were staring straight at the wall. We could measure almost exactly where our eyes were looking at. But this, we need to estimate the slope. Okay. So what I do is I tend to start with the most dramatic ones. So we know that we have this line drawn right now, right? And we know we have the horizon line drawn right now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by trying to find the slope of that line. So what I do is I hold my pencil out what I consider to be level. This is a cheat because I can actually look at the computer and say, well, that's level. And I look down and say, okay. Now what I'm looking for is trying to estimate the amount of wedge this is right there. So like that, how much of that wall is angling up. So I'm trying not to think of it as the object that it is. I'm just trying to graphically say, how much is that angling up? Okay. Now I have a way of trusting myself where I know that, got up here, I know 90 degrees. Okay, I can estimate 90 degrees pretty easy. I can estimate 45 degrees pretty easy. Right? That's a pretty easy one to estimate. I can cut that in half. I can see that, and I can see that. I don't try to estimate too much more of an accurate than that, right? Which one, when you think about what we're looking at, was it more this angle, that angle, or this angle? It was pretty close to this. It might have been a little below that, but it was pretty close to that, right? Let's look at it again. Let's think of, if I was to hold the pencil level, how steep of a line was that coming off? If we look up, it was about that much, right? Okay. So I tend to just not overthink those. I kind of figure out, what is it 45? Is it half 45 up? Is it half 45 down? Or as we see with the other one, is it just barely off of it or just barely off of it? So those are the lines I'm looking at. Middle, here, here, there, or there. Okay. So now in this one, I could even estimate. I could say, look, that would have been level. That would have been 45. But I know it was half 45, was pretty close to what it is. So there is my line. Okay. So I even kind of drew this whole thing out. I drew this whole thing out right here, right? I drew what would have been a 45. I did half the 45 and I measured that line. That is pretty close to what that is. Close enough for me to construct it. Now what's interesting here is now I can project this line. And there's my vanishing point. Okay. Vanishing point 1. Okay. Now, once I have that, if this is vanishing to it, well, then I also know that's vanishing. And there's my wall. Okay. Pretty nice. So that's how we figured out where this was. We know the vanishing point has to be on the horizon line. That's the whole point, is it's vanishing to the distance, and the distance is all converging on the vanishing point. On the horizon line, okay? But now we got to figure out where the other wall is going to, because remember, this back wall is not square anymore, it's actually perspecting. Look back up at this. And if I hold this up, and I'm looking at this side now, this wall, If I get up to the steep edge here and I hold this up, it is just barely off, right? It's not level. It's definitely just easing up a bit, right? Okay. So again, if I look at this one, I could say, well, that's level. If it was perpendicular, but I know it's not. And I know it's not as much as, let's say, there's the 45. I know it's not the half. I know it's just barely above that. So now this shoots off and this shoots off, and this might shoot off. You might not even see it. It might be off the page. Okay. So, well, what do I do if it's off the page? It's not a problem. Don't worry about it. Let it go off. Because what we do know is that it's a fan, right? It's even. It's going to be equally coming off. If I pick this one right here, which was, remember, this is 1 unit down, 1 unit up. I can say, well, look, this one's going to converge. It's going to lightly go on. Now, it's interesting is because this is equal distance above and below the horizon line, right? Then they are going to be equal angles away. So whatever this one goes on. One way to think about this is wherever we take a line here, let's look at something. We can look at where this door is, the same door that we drew before. So I'm going to take my increment, which was mullion hitting the corner, back right there. Say, okay, so I'm going 1 full unit over to the right edge of the store. What we're going to do, kind of fun. So 1 unit over. This distance and this distance is the same. I'm just going to draw a line here, really light line the whole way. So this is kind of fun. If you want to figure out a fan, like to get a whole bunch of perspective lines here, like construct the grid of perspective, think of it this way. If we knew that this one was correct, right? Well, I could take half the distance of here, and I could take half the distance to there. Because if I know if it's half this and half this, then that's lining up in the real world. Right? If I did half of this and half of this, I'm getting another fan. Right? If I took half that, I don't know what I'm going to need. I'm just drawing these in so that I can see the perspective happening correctly. This is a way of figuring out if you had some wood paneling or something you want it to look correctly, you know, or just getting those lines there. So now we've got that fan created, right? So even if I don't have a vanishing point, as long as I've got one going up there, if I take the line and one other line somewhere, I can take midpoint, 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 and start to get myself a grid, right? Okay. So let's start to look at this side and getting those windows in, because they're going to be, that's an interesting one. All right. So what we want to do is we're going to figure out where the first window is. And something that's interesting here is that the width of the window is the same as the width of the solid. So it's actually the same dimension not in perspective, but we know that this dimension actually equals this dimension physically in the real world, right? So this is kind of something that's kind of fun you can play with. So once we figure out where the first unit is in perspective, I take again, top of my caps the thing, and then I grab that corner. Say, how far over is the first window? Barely a third, right? And then the width of the first window is a half. Okay. So full increment over the first unit, we said it was barely a third, was where the first window starts. Right. And then we said it was half of a unit. So this half. Okay. So there's the left and right edge of this. Now, again, I got to find the bottom and top. You look, we got to find where this projects over and hits right there. So I could say of the unit of my unit, it hits about a third, and the top is about 2/3 up. Okay. So take, this is my unit right here. And I said it was about 1/3 up. And I can take and project. So there's about one, this is one full unit, it's about 1/3 up right there. I'm going to take this and project that out. I'm going to project it out the whole way because I know there's multiple windows, right? So I'm taking this sound effects. Okay. Now I'm also doing, remember, it was 1 and then 2/3 up. That's one full one there, about 2. Now this should be a fairly nice fan, right? I'm trying to get to where these all read, but they feel like they should all, no, it's not going right. I want you to practice. Yes, you can use a straight edge, but if you just, I want you to practice to get better at projecting those lines correctly. Okay, so that's going to be the top of the windows and the bottom of the windows the whole way. And I know this is the first window unit here, right? Okay, now this is an interesting thing. And I just want you to think about this. If we were to look straight at that wall, we know that there's a window. Right? And we know, if we were to just draw that elevation, that there is another window over here that is an equal distance away. That makes sense? So that distance, it's A, right? There's the same solid, and then there's another window. So it's the same repetition. It's just window, solid, window, right? Well, this is really interesting because if you think about it, if we want to figure out how, if we want to make this, we could graphically figure out exactly where this repetition is. But if I take the midpoint of this and I draw a diagonal through that midpoint, it will hit exactly at that distance away. Makes sense? That's midpoint, and a diagonal through, that's going to get the exact distance. If I put another midpoint there and cut through again, that's going to give you the next spot. Okay, midpoint again. I want you to understand that if we were to think about it, if we were just look at it in elevation, we'd have window, we could understand this is the next window, we do another midpoint here. I want you to just think like mathematically, however you want to consider this graphically. I want you to think how this makes sense if you were to draw it out. If I hit midpoint here and come across, it's going to hit the same distance away because it's midpoint and it's diagonal, right? They're complementary angles. Okay, well, if it happens in the real or in a straight elevation that way, it will also happen in perspective this way. So this is a great cheat. So what I'm going to do is look at the midpoint of this window. Oh, the midpoint of the window is actually right at the horizon line. Think about it. Because that mullion was right at the horizon. So now I can take that midpoint in this spot right here and I draw a line through, and that hits right there. That is exactly this line in perspective, right? So that means this is where the next vertical is. Right? Next one. Now I can say, okay, well, then I want to know how, if that window is exactly the same width as that, then I could go from here to there, which is exactly this line. And now I have the next unit. And I can go here. What this does is this gives us a very clear and effective way of creating, say, void, this is void. There's 3 windows. Okay. A really nice trick. Once you've determined one size, you can then use that to do an incremental. So if you've got structure on a screen or a panel that's broken down, this is a way of figuring out and getting the perspective going away. All right, so let's say this. Okay, let's do a little bit more with the idea that these windows are sunken. So we're seeing more lines than just this. So what happens is there's a thickness to this wall, right? And that's what's kind of nice here is that even the window is set back, right? There's a nice return here. The jamb is quite deep, and then there's even a little return there. So the window, so there's like, although this was the edge, if we take our measurement for our unit, you know, the window was half, but a solid third of the window is just actually going back to where we see it, right? So if we were to look at this, we could say, okay, this is the window, about a third of that is just us getting the return back there. Okay. Now, we can also see the sill of it. So we can actually see there's a line that's going to go from this corner back, and then there's the sill. We can actually see a line of where that interior wall, the jamb wall, comes up to the head. So there's actually a little line that's right there. So what we're going to do is going to draw the depth of that. So because this surface of the jamb is parallel to this, it's going to be going to that same perspective. So this line, if I was to look, I'm taking this gradient of lines because it's in that same perspective, that same point, that little return is going to be the same as these. It's parallel to the plan. Right? And now the window returns respect to there. And now all of a sudden we've got our window jamb recess, right? No spatial edge return right there. And now we've got some depth, and we're understanding that's pocketed. Same way, about a third of it's coming here. Easier to see because these, remember, it's still going to follow those perspectives. These are still going to follow those perspectives. This is going to follow this perspective. That straight out to here. That line, if you can just follow it, it's going to hit there too. Same line. Sense. Now we've got and now this one again. You can start estimating how does this interpolating where that perspective staying on this span. All right. So the difference between the one point where we were looking directly squared up, we might still have gotten the whole room and all the other information over here. But you notice, like, when we do a 1 point, the drawing makes us really focus on this, the idea that all the things are converging to it. It's hard for us not, even if there's interesting stuff over here, it's hard not just to focus on that. So only use 1 point perspectives when the subject matter right here is what's most important, because it drives our view to it so hard. If this isn't important to you, then you're not doing your drawing justice or probably communicating with the user. Where if it's maybe about movement through the room, all of a sudden now we're directed to kind of looking at maybe out the windows, following some people moving, the chairs, how the organization's coming across. Oh, this will be interesting. Actually, let's do one more thing. What I want to do is notice that this big beam comes down right in the middle of this one, okay? And it's also, I think it was at a full 2 up. So I know it's increment. I can project this line out to figure out where the base is, but I know it's centered between the second and third window. So let's figure out how to construct that down here. So if I want to find the middle of this, it is not measuring the exact distance and setting the middle. If I was going to do that, it would be like right here, but this wall's in perspective. So that's actually not the physical middle. If I want to find the physical middle of this, watch what happens if I draw an X. Where those things cross would be the middle, right? And then the beam is going to be up above. So if I form an X, I always find the middle. So on this one, okay, that middle is closer to this side than it is to that side, because in perspective, that middle is actually pushed back. This is smaller than that. So now that gave me the center line of that beam. I could just estimate a little bit to this side and a little less to that side because the foreshortened side. Now I can do the height, say it's about that. I think it was a 2 full. So if I take this and project out, I then have the bottom of that beam. Okay, so I figured out the top by centering it. I mean, the center line of that. I have this edge and I have this edge. Now it's shooting across. So I know it's in plan, it's parallel to this back wall, which means it's going off of those same vanishing points. So now I can use those same fans, interpolate a little farther, and see, I'm trying to keep this fan to just be incremental off those, like it's all going to that same location. And feeling. All right. Yes, there we go. No matter what, when we're out drawing, all of you are going to ask me at some point, something's going wrong in my drawing, it's not really working. It's usually because you didn't do the horizon line correctly. It's not actually at your perspective. So make sure where, if you're sitting, then it's that eye height. If you're standing, it's that eye height. So make sure the horizon line's first. There's a strong vertical second. You figure out your unit based on that horizon line on the strong vertical. You then figure out your vanishing points. You have to do them in that order. If you want to construct a vignette correctly, you need to make sure those fundamental things, the bones of it, are done correctly. Okay, then we start to box out the volume. If you do this really quickly, you start to figure out whether or not you like the perspective. So I might do this really quick just to figure out if this is the one I want to do, right? Then I can spend some time putting more detail and figuring stuff out. Or do I want to move a little bit and get a different view? Okay, so I need you to do this over and 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 over.